Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and today we will be learning Mirza Hashem Daf Chaf Hey Amid Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We began in the last year Siman Reish Dun Daled, where we're primarily speaking about the Shaila of Shehiyah as it applies to roasted meat. It occurred to me this morning, there are a lot of contemporary sayings that we have nowadays that if you look into them, they're all rooted either in Tanakh or in Mamorei Chazal. So there's the famous saying, it's like jumping from the frying pan into the fire. I feel a little bit like from Reish Nun Gimel to Reish Nun Daled is jumping from the frying pan into the fire. In Reish Nun Gimel, we were primarily speaking about foods that are being cooked in a pot. And we saw that Reish Nun Gimel was a very difficult siman. Now we're going over to Reish Nun Daled, and we're not talking about in a pot anymore, although we are going to have cases today that speak about meat inside a pot, but primarily we're speaking about sli, roasting, eitz al ha'esh, exposed next to the fire, or al gabe ha'esh, or on top of the fire, and we'll see that Reish Nun Daled is not a pasha to siman either. So it's a little bit like jumping from the frying pan into the fire. Today, when I'm recording this, is Rosh Chodesh Av, Michshenichnas Av, Mematin B'Simcha. Av, the 9 days, a time of tsar for Klal Yisrael, because of the chet of the Meraglim. Primarily, the Rebbe Shalom was geyser on Klal Yisrael, B'chiyah L'Doros. Both Batei Migdash were destroyed on Tisha B'Av. Countless other tsaras happened to Klal Yisrael over the generations on Tisha B'Av. Now it's an Eis Tzara L'Yaakov as well. As I'm recording this, everybody is worrying about the possibility of an imminent attack from the Rishon in Iran on Eretz Yisrael. Everything is Hakol B'dei Shamayim, Mirza Hashem. The Rebbe Shalom should be Mekayim. He should be Hafachta Mispedi L'Machayli. The Rebbe Shalom should turn Tisha B'Av into Taka Amayid. The pasuk in Eicha refers to Tisha B'Av as a Mayid, and Chazal say that ultimately Tisha B'Av will become a Mayid. It will become a Yom Tov. Mirza Hashem, it should be Meher V'Yameinu. It should be this year. Tisha B'Av should be turned from a time of tsar into a time of simcha. It's also the yard site of Aaron HaKohen. Aaron HaKohen died on Rosh Chodesh Av, so it's the yard site of Aaron HaKohen. The schus of Torah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shalom should listen to the tefillas of Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shalom should see the Torah learning of Klal Yisrael, and that should stand us in good stead. And we should see the Bias Gal Tzedek, not just a temporary Yeshua from the tsaras that are going on now, but rather a Geula Shlema the Rebbe Shalom should finally bring. The Rebbe Shalom should say L'Tzarisenu Dai. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Beis Yisrael, Hanasudim Batzara Bashivya Ha'imdim Ben Bayamu Ben Bayabasha Hamakayim Yerachem Aleim V'Yitziam Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'afela L'Oira U'Mishibad L'Geula Hashta Bagala V'Zman Kariv and Amarmein. Our learning should be a schus refuah shalema for David Ben Blima. He should have a refuah shalema b'say Shar Chel Yisrael. Also for Yeshua Matanya Ben Rachel Shalva should have a refuah shalema b'Karev. Okay. So now, Nachzer in Yanenu. Here in Siman Reish Nun Daled. So, in Reish Nun Gimel, we learned about the Issa D'Rabbanan of Shehiyah. What's the Issa D'Rabbanan of Shehiyah? It's not always mutter to take a pot of food and put it on a kira, she'ena grufa uketuma. So you have this kira stove that has fire or coals down inside, 2 openings on top, to put pots on top of. You want to take your food on Erev Shabbos, you want to put it on the kira, you want to leave it there going into Shabbos. Shehiyah means to delay, to wait, to maintain. You want to have the pots wait on top of the kira going into Shabbos. If the kira is eina grufa uketuma, if you haven't swept out the coals from inside the kira or you haven't banked them, it's not always mutter to leave that food on top of the kira going into Shabbos. Why? Because of the chashash shem yechata b'gechalim. We're afraid that you might be tempted to go ahead and stoke the coals on Shabbos, thereby being over Isser Daraisa of Havara. Could also be kivui involved, could also be bishul involved, because you might be accelerating the cooking of whatever's on top of the kira. So we don't want you to be mechata b'gechalim. We're afraid that you might. We have a chash shem yechata b'gechalim, and therefore there are times when shehiyah is aser. That's the iser d'Rabbanan of shehiyah. We've learned all about it. We've seen the exceptions. We've seen the ways that you could do shehiyah in Reish Nun Gimel. We've seen the various machlokes and different shitas when it comes to the iser d'Rabbanan of shehiyah. But one of the great exceptions that we saw to the iser d'Rabbanan of shehiyah is if you take a pot and you have a tavshil, you're cooking something inside this pot that contains raw meat. If you take a cholent that has raw flanken in it, and you take it and you put it on the fire right before Shabbos, then you could do shehiyah even on a kira she'ena grufu ktuma. You really don't need a blech. Why? Because we're not afraid shemi yechata b'gechalim. Why are we not afraid shemi yechata b'gechalim? Because if the flanken is raw right before Shabbos, then you're Mesiach Das, you're Miyayish on this cholent to eat it Friday night. You're not expecting to eat this cholent Friday night. You put it up right before Shabbos. You know it's going to be raw when the Shabbos night Suda comes around. So you're not going to be mechata b'gecholim. You're only going to be mechata b'gecholim if you want to hurry up something so you should have it for the Suda. But you know you're not having this for the Suda. And tomorrow, by the Shabbos day Suda tomorrow, it'll definitely be cooked. So when you put basar chai on the fire, raw meat on the fire right before Shabbos, there is no chshach shemi yechata b'gecholim, and therefore there is no iser shehiyah. That's what we learned in the beginning of Siman Reish Nun Gimel. Having said that, right here in the beginning of Siman Reish Nun Daled, in Reish Nun Daled Sif Aleph, the Mechaber told us that there's an exception to that rule. And that is, that's true when you're taking basar chai, when you're taking raw meat, and you're cooking it in a tavshil, in a pot. Then you're going to be miyayish from having it for the Friday night Suda, because it takes too long to cook. So you're not going to have it for the Friday night Suda. There's no chshash shemi yechata b'gecholim. But what if you're not cooking this basar chai in a pot? What if you're taking this basar chai and you're roasting it next to the hot coals? Not on top of, next to. If you're roasting the meat next to hot coals, then the Mechaber said the heter of basar chai, the leniency of raw meat, does not apply. This you're not allowed to do, samach l'chashecha, even though the meat is raw. To take raw meat and put it next to the gecholim right before Shabbos and do shehiyah, leave the raw meat next to the hot coals going into Shabbos, that you're not allowed to do, because there is a chshash shemi yechata b'gecholim. If you're roasting meat next to hot coals, you're not going to be miyayish from having that meat for the Friday night Suda. Why? Because when you roast meat next to an open fire or next to hot coals, it can get ready very quickly. A pot with liquid in it takes a long time to cook. But if you're doing a grill, if you're roasting your meat next to hot coals, it could get ready very quickly. Therefore, you're not going to be miyayish from eating it for your Friday night Suda. And now there is a chshash of shemi yechata b'gecholim, even though the meat was raw right before Shabbos. So the heter of basar chai, the heter of doing shehiyah on meat that was completely raw right before Shabbos, that heter exists when you're cooking it in a tafshil, in a pot, but that heter does not exist when you're roasting it next to hot coals. This is the halacha that we saw in the beginning of Reish Nun Daled Sif Aleph, and now the Mechaber is going to qualify that. Says the Mechaber, Chav Hei Amid Aleph, near the end of the top line. Says the Mechaber, V'hani mili b'besar shor oy ez. This is true when you're dealing with beef, when you're dealing with the meat of a shor, of an ox, oy ez, or you're dealing with the meat of an adult goat. Now, what is it about these types of meat? Says the Mishnah Berurah is cotton vav, bebesar shor, shehu basar kosher. This is tough meat. It's dense meat. V'tzarch bishul b'yoiser. This type of meat needs more cooking. V'chayshina l'chatuye, and therefore we're worried that you're going to be mechata b'gecholim. What the Mechaber is saying is that besar shor, beef, or besar ez, or the meat of an adult goat, that's the sweet spot to create an iser of shehiyah. Why? Because on the one hand, if you're roasting beef or you're roasting this Basar A's by an open fire next to hot coals, it could get ready fast enough for the Shabbos night Suda. Therefore, you're not going to be miyayish. On the other hand, this meat requires enough heat and it requires enough cooking that you might be tempted to be mechata b'gecholim. So it's that sweet spot. It could get ready for the Friday night Suda, so you're not miyayish. On the other hand, it's basar kosher, it's tough meat that requires a nice degree of cooking, so you might go ahead and be mechata b'gecholim in order for it to be ready for the Friday night Suda. So that's what the Mechaber is saying. It's that sweet spot to create an Isser Shehiyah. So it says again, let's go back to the Mechaber. V'hani mili b'besar shor oyez, avol besar gedi. But if you're dealing with the meat of a young goat, which is more tender, v'oif, or you're dealing with poultry, shehem minutachim le'evarim. If you're dealing with the tender meat of a young goat, or you're dealing with poultry that has been cut up. So these are meats, you've cut them up into smaller cuts, then mutter. Then you do have a heter of basar chai, according to the Mechaber, even by tzli. These type of meats, you have poultry cut up into small cuts, you have the flesh, the meat of a young goat, which is tender, also cut up into small chops or small cuts. Then if it's raw, you could even roast it next to the gecholim if it was completely raw going into Shabbos, right before Shabbos. Why? Says the Mechaber, mutter over here, this would be mutter, deloi chayshina lechitui. Because over here again, we're going to have no chashash shemi yechata b'gecholim. Why, says the Mechaber? She'im yechata b'gecholim. Because with this kind of meat, with the tender meat of a young goat or poultry that's cut up into small pieces, if you're going to do chitui, yischarech, it's going to catch and it's going to char. Pirush, the Ramah says in the parentheses, what does yischarech mean? Yetze migeder hatzli, it's not going to be properly roasted meat. V'nichnas begeder hanisraf. It's going to become charred and it's going to be scorched and burnt. Habasar, that's what's going to happen to the meat. Because these kinds of meat only need a small degree of heat. They don't need such cooking. So again, what the Mechaber is saying is, this that I'm telling you here in Sif Aleph Reish Nun Dalet, that there is no heter of basar chai when you're roasting meat next to hot coals. That's true when you're dealing with a relatively tough meat, beef or an adult goat. That's the sweet spot to create an isser. On the one hand, it could roast fast enough that it should be available for the Friday night Suda. So you're not miyayish from it. So you want it to be cooked. You're expecting to eat it. On the other hand, it needs enough heat that you might be mechata b'gecholim in order to get it ready. So then there's a chashash shemi yechata b'gecholim, and there's an issur d'rabbanan of shehiyah. But when it comes to tender poultry, tender young goat that's cut up into small pieces, over there is no chashash shemi yechata b'gecholim, even by roasting. Why? Because over there, if you're mechata b'gecholim, you're going to char the meat. You're going to ruin the meat. So we're not choishish shemi yechata b'gecholim. So there is a heter of basar chai, and you would be able to put it next to the coals, even though they're not grufa uketuma, right before Shabbos, and there is no isser of shehiyah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting zayin. Avo besar gedi, the meat of a young goat, hainu gedi harach, a young tender goat, where this meat or this poultry is cut up into small pieces. But if we're talking even about a tender young goat or poultry that's not cut up, then it needs the degree of cooking similar to beef or an adult goat. And if you're mechata, if you stoke the coals, it will not char. So in order to have this heter of basar chai, even by cut up poultry or the cut up meat of a young goat, it has to be that it's cut up. If it's not cut up, you don't get this heter. Because if it's not cut up, again, we're going to have a chash shema yechate b'gacholim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ois cotton test. In these cases, if you have the meat of a tender young goat cut up or poultry cut up, then mutter, then shehiyah is mutter, bein imhu chai legamri. Realize that when the Mechaber says that shehiyah is mutter, it means shehiyah is going to be mutter whether the meat is raw, the heter of basar chai, from Reish Nun Gimel, oy shenispashal ktsas, or even if it's partially cooked. Remember, partially cooked, nisbashal ktsas, is usually a reason to be machmir. When food is partially cooked, that's when we have a greater concern, shemi yechata b'gecholim, because you might want to accelerate the cooking and have it for the Friday night Suda. But says the Mishnah Berurah, over here, when the Mechaber says that when you're dealing with the meat of a tender young goat that's cut up or poultry that's cut up, it's mutter, shehiyah is mutter. It's not only mutter when it's raw, it's mutter even if it's nispashal ktsas. Why is it mutter even if it's nispashal ktsas? Again, because there's no room for a chash shemi yechata b'gecholim. The whole isser of shehiyah is always built on the concern shema yechata b'gecholim. But by these kinds of meat, says the Mechaber, there is no chash shema yechata b'gecholim, because if you're mechata b'gecholim, you're going to scorch, char, burn the meat, and you're going to ruin it. So then there is no chash shema yechata b'gecholim. Uketalamon b'hagah. Ois cotton yud. The Mechaber explained his heter over here. He said, by these kinds of meats, she'im yechata b'gecholim, you're going to ruin the meat. Says the Mishnah Berurah, lefi tam zeh, according to the rationale being given over here by the Mechaber, ein chiluk beinim tzerleu betanur shepiv mechuseh. According to the rationale of the Mechaber is telling you that by these kind of meats, if you're mechata b'gecholim, you're going to ruin the meat. And that's why there is no Isser Shehiyah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, according to this, Ein chilik beinim tzaleu betanu shepiv mechusa. It doesn't matter if you're doing this roasting inside of an oven with coals and the oven is open, so it's very easy to get in there and do chitoi, or you're doing it outside of an oven. You have a pile of coals and you're doing it right next to the gecholim. Da kol shari. Everything would be mutter, because the reason there is no isser of shehiyah is because there's no room for chash shemi yechata b'gecholim. Because if you're mechata b'gecholim, you're going to ruin the meat. Aval, however, says the Mishnah Berurah, yesh machmirin de lakamei b'hagah. We're going to see in the Ramah very soon a yesh machmirin. We're going to see another shita. Says the Mishnah Berurah over here, according to that yesh machmirin that we'll see soon, sovereign, they hold the einoi mutter b'gdiva oif, that the only heter that there is by the tender cut up meat of a young goat or by poultry, ki im kishetzeleu betanor shepiv mechuse, that's only when you're roasting the meat next to coals inside a tanor that has a closed lid. V'rak she'ena tuach petit. But the lid is not sealed with clay. We're going to see as we go further that there is another heter that we're going to speak about, which is, what if you're roasting meat inside a tanur and the door to the tanur is sealed with clay? So now, in order to be mechata b'gecholim, you have to break open the clay, get inside, and do chitui. So that's going to be a reason lahatir. That's going to be a tam lahatir, when you have an oven with a door that's sealed with clay. We're going to see that the yesh machmirin, the very stringent shita that we're going to see in the Ramah, they hold that this heter of cut up young tender goat meat or cut up poultry, they're going to say that this heter only applies if you're roasting next to coals inside a closed oven. The extra heter that we have by the tender goat meat or the tender poultry is that even if the door is not sealed with clay, we'll still have a heter, as long as it's closed. Then we're going to say a heter that we're not choshesh shemi yechata b'gecholim Because if you open the door of the oven, the cold air is going to get in, and somehow it's going to denigrate the quality of the roasting meat. But if you're roasting this tender goat meat or tender cut up poultry next to an exposed fire outside of a tanur, again, he's giving us a heads up. The Mechaber is telling you a heter. The Mechaber is drawing a distinction between tough beef and tender young goat that's cut up and tender poultry that's cut up. And the Mechaber is giving a blanket heter. The Mechaber is telling you when you're dealing with these kinds of meat that will char very easily, there's never a chash shem yechata b'gecholim, because if you mechata b'gecholim, you're going to ruin the meat. Says the Mishnah Berurah, so it comes out that according to the Mechaber, that's kind of like a blanket heter. But he's giving us a heads up. We're going to see in the Ramah a yesh machmirin. Realize that when we come to that yesh machmirin in the Ramah, the yesh machmirin is not going to give such a blanket heter to these kinds of meats, to tender young goat that's cut up and tender poultry that's cut up. According to him, they're going to have only a very small extra heter. The very small extra heter that they're going to have is that if they're being roasted next to coals inside an oven and the door is closed, but the door is not sealed with clay, it's going to be mutter. Normally, we're only going to give a heter if the door is sealed with clay. By these kind of meats, we're going to give a heter even if it's not sealed with clay. That's the only extra heter that the yesh machmirin is going to give to these kinds of meats, and we're going to see that. We're going to get into that topic right now. Let's go weiter in the Mechaber. Let's go to the third line down at the end of the line. Nu halacha, says the Mechaber. Okay, we're talking about roasting next to coals, and the Mechaber is telling you that roasting next to coals has a chumrah over cooking in liquid in a pot, right? By roasting over coals, even if the meat is raw, when you come into Shabbos, sometimes Shia is still going to be aser, because since it could get hot, it could get cooked very fast, there's a chash, shemi yechata b'gecholim. Then he differentiated between different types of meats. And he said, tender cut up goat, tender cut up poultry, over there is no chash shemi yechata b'gecholim, because you would ruin it by being mechata. So over there it's mutter. And the Mishnah Berurah said it's mutter even if it's this bashal k'tzas going into Shabbos, it's still mutter, because there's no chash shemi yechata b'gecholim. Now says the Mechaber like this. What if you're not roasting these meats next to coals that are exposed on the ground? What if you're doing it inside a tanur? And not only are you doing it inside a tanur, you're doing it inside a tanur with a door, and you sealed the door with clay. Says the Mechaber, V'imu b'tanur v'toch piv b'tit. If you're doing this roasting inside a tanur, right? This is the tanur that has the place for the pot on top, but the coals are inside. You're putting the meat inside next to the coals. You're closing the door. You're sealing the door with clay. Then says the Mechaber, Bein gediva oif shlemim, whether you're dealing with tender young goats and poultry, but they're whole, so you're roasting like a whole gedi, or you're roasting a whole chicken. Bein besar shor oy eiz, or you're roasting beef or the meat of an adult goat. Mutter, everything is mutter, says the Mechaber. Once you're doing your roasting inside an oven and you sealed the door of the oven with clay, the Mechaber says now there's no longer any chash shemi yechata b'gecholim, and now this is all mutter. Why? Says the Mechaber. Now the why is very critical here, because we're going to see that there's a difference of opinion between the Mechaber and the Ramah of exactly why there's a heter when you're doing roasting inside an oven where the door is sealed with clay. Let's pay attention to what the Mechaber says. The Mechaber says the reason for this heter is mutter deloy chayshina lechitoi. Now it's mutter because we have no kshash shemi yechata b'gecholim she'im balif tayach hatanor, because if you're going to break the clay and open up the oven door or lechatois in order to stoke the coals, what's going to happen? Tikanes haruach, The cold air is going to enter the oven, v'yitztanei natanor, and it's going to cool off the oven, v'yiskasha habasar, that's going to make the meat tough, v'yafsid, and you're going to ruin the meat. So why exactly is the mechaber being makel when you're roasting next to coals inside a tanner with a sealed door? Because why did you do this? The mechaber is saying like this: when you roast and you're so careful, you put it in, you close the door, and then you sealed around it with clay. The reason you're doing this is because, our ovens, the door has a gasket. You don't want any air getting in. And you're being so careful not to get air get in that you went ahead and you sealed the whole door with clay. Why? Because you know that if cold air gets in, it's going to cool down your tanner, and then the meat's not going to get seared, it's not going to cook the same way, and it's going to be tough, and it's going to be ruined. Says the mechaber, if that's what you're doing, then there's no chash that you're going to break open the seal and go be mechata b'gecholim. You went through all of this trouble to make sure that no air is getting into your oven, and it shouldn't denigrate the quality of your meat. Now we're going to be choishish that you're going to break open the seal and you're going to be mechata b'gecholim? So says the mechaber, you're dealing with roasting next to coals inside a tanner where you went and you sealed the door with clay? There's no more room for a chash shemi mechata b'gecholim. Now you could do shehiyah inside that tanner, even though it's not gorifikotum, and you could do it by basar chai, by basar shor, you could do it by beef, you could do it by a gedi that's not cut up, you could do it with a whole chicken. Everything's mutter now, because there's no basis for a chash shema yechate b'gecholim. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ois cotton yod aleph. V'yiskasha basar, because there's no room for a chash shema yechate b'gecholim. You're going to ruin your meat. You're going to cool down the oven and make your meat tough. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'im hu bikdeira. Let's say you're roasting the meat, not that the meat is laying down inside the tanner, exposed next to the coals. You took the meat, you put it in a pot, you closed the pot, you put the pot inside the tanner next to the coals. Now, this is very tricky. In the beginning of this Siman, in the beginning of Reish Don Dalet on Chav Dalet Amid Beis, in Mishnah Berurah Oist Koton Gimel, that's near the bottom of the Mishnah Berurah on Chav Dalet Amid Beis, the Mishnah Berurah told us that this Siman is talking about roasting meat exposed next to coals. If you roast meat inside a pot that's closed, that doesn't have a din of tzli. That's Reish Nun Gimel. If you put meat in a pot and you roast it next to coals, that's the equivalent of cooking meat in a tavshil, in liquid in a pot. And the halachas that pertain to a pot, the halachas of shehiyah that pertain to a pot, pertain to this. This is called tzli kedar. This is you're roasting it inside a pot. That is the same din as cooking in a kedera. Okay, what's the din over there? The din over there is that if it's raw before Shabbos, basar chai in a pot, you're allowed to do shehiyah because you're miyayish on it. It's not going to be ready for the Friday night Suda. So there's no chash of shemi yechata b'gecholim. So the Mishnah Berurah over here, in the beginning of Mishnah Berurah, is cut yod aleph. V'im hu b'kedera. Says the Mishnah Berurah like this. The mechaber just said, if you're roasting meat inside a tanner, and you sealed the door of the tanner with clay, everything becomes mutter. Why? Because there's no basis for a chash shemi yechata b'gecholim, because you're not going to break open the seal and be mechata b'gecholim, because if you do so, the air is going to hit the meat, and it's going to denigrate the quality of the meat. Says the Mishnah Berurah like this. How about if you're roasting meat inside a pot inside the tanner? Inside a closed pot inside the tanner. Now let's analyze this. If it's in a pot and it's in the tanner, that has the din of a kedera. The din of a kedera is that if the meat is raw, then you're allowed to do shehiyah right before Shabbos. So I don't need an extra heter. In order to be matir that kind of shehiyah, I don't need an oven that has a sealed door. That's always mutter. To put up a pot, to put up the cholent with raw meat right before Shabbos is always mutter. because there's no shashem yechata b'gechalim. You mesiach das, you meyayish. You don't expect to eat that for the Friday night Suda. So when the Mishnah Berurah comes over here, and the Mishnah Berurah is telling me, now, v'imu b'kdeira loy mahani kishu tuach petit. The Mishnah Berurah is saying, if you're roasting in a pot inside the oven, then this heter of having a sealed door doesn't apply. He's clearly not talking about raw meat. Because if he was talking about raw meat, I don't need the heter of the sealed door. If I'm talking about raw meat in a pot, that's always mutter. Shehiyah is always mutter right before Shabbos. So you know what the Mishnah Berurah is talking about here? He's talking about meat that's partially cooked. Meat that's nispashal ktsas, meat that's partially cooked, but it's not mavushal kol tzarchai, it's not, let's say, mavushal kamaychel ben drusai, that there is an isser of shehiyah in a pot, because it's partially cooked, so you might be able to get it ready for the Friday night Suda, so you might be mechata b'gechalim. Says the Mishnah Berurah like this, the Mechaber just introduced to us a new heter. He told us a heter that if you're roasting meat exposed next to the coals inside a tanner, but you sealed the door of the tanner with clay, now everything becomes mutter because there's no chash shemi yechata b'gechalim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, let's apply that to another case. How about if I have a kedera? How about if I have a pot? I have a cholent. Can I put the cholent inside an oven and seal the door with tit? If it's a partially cooked cholent, not a raw cholent. A raw cholent is always mutter. A raw cholent I could put on top of the kira right before Shabbos, and there's no isser or shia. But how about if I have a partially cooked cholent? It's not fully cooked. That's not cooked Michael ben Drusai. That's when you have the isser of shehiyah always. Can I take care of the isser of shehiyah by taking my partially cooked cholent and putting it inside a tanur and sealing the door with clay? Says the Mishnah Berurah, according to this Mechaber, no. And this is why I told you it's very important to understand what's behind the heter of a sealed oven door according to the Mechaber. Let's see what the Mishnah Berurah says. V'imu b'ktera. If you want to take a partially cooked cholent and you want to stick it inside this oven and seal the door with clay, loy mahani kishuhu tuach petit l'deyazu. This heter of the sealed oven door is not going to help for that. Why? The haloyis kasha. Because the cholent is not going to get ruined. You know why? Because it's in a closed pot. What's the whole reason the meat's going to get ruined if you break open the seal and you open the door? Because the cold air is going to get in and it's going to hit the exposed roasting meat. But if you have partially cooked meat inside a cholent, inside a closed pot, if you break open the oven door, the cold air is not going to hit it. It's protected from the cold air because it's in a closed pot. So the heter of an oven that's closed and tuach petit is not going to take off the iser shehiyah of a pot containing a tavshil containing partially cooked meat, because it's protected from the cold air. That's what this Mishnah Berurah means. La'anias daiti. Now take a look later in the Ramah. The Masik is going to conclude that minig lahakal bazeh. He's going to say that the minig is to be makel, that if you take this cholent with partially cooked meat in a closed pot and you do put it inside an oven and seal the door, we could be makel, and shehiyah is going to be mutter, according to the Ramah. I'll give you a heads up. The reason is because the Ramah holds that the heter of a sealed oven door is a different heter. According to the Mechaber, the heter of the sealed oven door is you're not going to break the seal and allow the cold air to get in and hit the meat. According to the Ramah, the heter of a sealed oven door is once you seal an oven door, you're so far removed from chitui, you're so far removed from stoking the coals. Because in order to stoke the coals, you need to break open the seal, open the door, then go stoke the coals. The Rabbah holds you're not going to go that far to do an Isser on Shabbos. You're going to realize the fact that the door is closed and sealed is going to serve as a hecker. And you're going to realize that you can't be Mechata B'Gechalim. You're not going to go through all of that trouble to be Mechata B'Gechalim. Now, if that's what drives the heter of a sealed oven door, then it could apply to a partially cooked cholent in a pot as well. The partially cooked cholent in a pot that's sealed inside the oven, I'm not going to go break open the seal and open the door in order to be mechata b'gechalim. So the Ramah is going to say that we could be mekel in that case. My heart tells me that I need to go over this to make sure that the listeners all chap what's going on over here. But the beauty of this kind of recorded share is you could hit the review button and you could listen to Rabbi Weiss say it again. And we're already 35 minutes in and we have a lot more to do, so we got to go weiter. The Svira lay, going weiter in Eis Katan Yud Aleph, because the Ramah holds, since the door is sealed, and you're not ready to do chitoi, because in order to do chitoi, you got to break open the seal and open the door. It's sealed with clay. You're not going to come to chitoi, and therefore there is no basis for a chash of shemi yechata b'gechalim, and therefore even a partially cooked cholent in a pot would be mutter to do shehiyah inside a sealed oven where the door is sealed with clay. Okay. So we've seen over here the Mechaber, where the Mechaber is telling us, yes, there is an isser of doing shehiyah when you're roasting next to coals by certain types of meat, even if the meat is raw right before Shabbos, because you're not Mesiach Das, and you might come to be Mechata b'gechalim. On the other hand, there are certain types of meat, cut up young tender goat, cut up poultry, where you don't have a chash shebi yechata b'gechalim, because if you're Mechata b'gechalim, you're going to burn it and you're going to ruin it. We see another heter of a sealed oven door, where the Mechaber is saying, a sealed oven door, if you break open the seal, you're going to ruin the heat. So a sealed oven door obviates the chash of shemi yechata b'gechalim. We saw from the Mishnah Berurah that that's not going to apply to something that's closed in a pot, because the air is not going to ruin what's contained in the pot. Now, says the Ramah, Haggah, you should realize, ve'ein chilik bazeh, with all of these heterim and all of these isurim that we've seen over here so far in Reish Nun Daled. So, on the one hand, we have an isser. We have an isser where we say that the heter of basar chai does not apply when you're roasting next to coals, because you're not Mesiach Das, you might come to be Mechata b'gechalim. So that's an isser that we've seen. We also see heterim. We see that there is a heter by basar gedi, by basar oif. We see that there's a heter of an oven where the door is sealed with clay. Says the Ramah, when it comes to all of these isurim and all of these heterim, ein chilik bazeh beinim hu chai legamri. There's no difference if we're talking about meat that's completely raw, oishin is partial ktsas, or we're dealing with meat that's partially cooked. What does the Ramah mean? Well, let's realize. Basar chai, completely raw meat, is usually a tam leheter. Usually it's a mila. We could be more makel when meat is totally raw right before Shabbos, because if the meat's totally raw, we have a tzad to say that you're Mesiach Das from eating it for the Friday night Suda. Nispashal ktsas, if the meat is partially cooked, that's usually a tam le'isser. That usually makes us be more machmir, because if it's already partially cooked going into Shabbos, there's more of a chance it'll be ready for the Friday night Suda. There's more of a basis for an isser for a chash shemi yechata b'gechalim. Says the Ramah, everything that you just learned in the Ramah, the isser of going ahead and roasting, let's say, basar shar next to hot coals, that isser is going to apply even if the basar is chai. Even if you have a tzad heter, because the meat was totally raw, the isser is going to apply anyway. Why? Because like the Mechaber said, you still have a chash shebi yechata b'gechalim. On the other hand, the heterim that the Mechaber said, when the Mechaber said it's mutter by the tender meat of a young goat that's cut up, or tender poultry that's cut up, or when the Mechaber said that it's mutter if you put it in an oven and you seal the door with clay, the heterim are going to exist even if you have a tzad iser, because the meat is nispashal ktsas. So you're not Mesiach Das. These heterim will still apply. Why? Because we've obviated the concern of shebi yechata b'gechalim. Either because you'll ruin the meat, or because the door is sealed. That's what the Ramah means. Ve'ein chilik bazeh beinim hu chai legamri oishin nispashal ktsas. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah Katan Yud Beis that speaks this out. Ve'ein chilik. Koi akol gavni heter v'gavni iser hamavuwarim b'sifzeh. The Ramah with this comment is referring to all of the Isurim and all the Heterim that we've seen so far in this Sif. Vedan, you should know, says the Mishnah Berurah. T'chol zeh dafka be'inyanenu d'mayri le'inyan tzli. Let's remember, everything that we're learning is in the context of Siman Reish Nun Daled, where we're talking about roasting next to hot coals. Aval le'inyan k'dera. But according to the Mechaber, if we're talking about food that's in a pot, with liquid, or even if you're putting dry meat inside a pot, so you're roasting it dry inside a closed pot. Degam kein dinoi kedera, which I told you earlier, says the Chavetz Chaim, in Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Gimel. I told you that if you put dry meat inside a pot and you roast it next to hot coals, that has the din of cooking in liquid in a pot. Yesh chiluk ben chai l'nispashlu k'tzas. Over there, we have to go back to the rules that we learned in Reish Nun Gimel. If you're dealing with something inside a pot, then we're not talking the language of Reish Nun Daled. Then we're talking the language of Reish Nun Gimel. And then there is a difference between whether it's raw or whether it's partially cooked. Raw is a tzad heter, because if it's raw right before Shabbos, you're Mesiach Das. Nispashlu k'tzas is it tzad iser, because you're not Mesiach Das, like the Mishnah Berurah says. Dibechai, if you're dealing about raw meat in a pot, mikalinon, we could be mekel, litanoi samach l'chashecha, to put it by the fire right before Shabbos, bein besar shar, bein besar gediva oif, whether you're talking about beef, or you're talking about goats, or you're talking about poultry, because it's raw. You're Mesiach Das. It's in a pot. It's not roasting next to a fire. It's in a pot. A pot, you Mesiach Das. Is partial k'tzas, but if it's partially cooked, also, then it's going to be also to do shehiyah before Shabbos. Afilu b'sar gediva oif, even if you're talking about a tender young goat or poultry, because shem yechata. Because then, in a pot, I am worried, kshash shem yechata. Even if it's cut up poultry, we're not afraid that you're going to scorch it or char it. It's protected. It's in a pot. Because it's in a pot. Now, when we talk about nispashal k'tzas, what does it mean partially cooked? Okay, for that you have to chazer Siman Reish Nun Gimel. Mevur le'el b'reish Siman Reish Nun Gimel. There kamaisa, the first opinion said, Svir lahu, they hold, the aji is pashal called tzarchai. What does nispashal k'tzas mean? Nispashal k'tzas means anything that's not fully cooked. Ukishi is pashal yoysa yim stomach varaloi. According to the day Rishon in Reish Nun Gimel, partially cooked means until you get it to the degree of nispashal called tzarchai, fully cooked, and mitztamik varaloi, and continued cooking will denigrate the quality. Vayesh oimrim sham, the Deishni over there held, svirale, the mikevich and nispashal kamachal ben drusai, once meat is cooked half of the way, manchal ben drusai, nikra bishul gomer, that's called fully cooked, and you're allowed to do shehiyah even on a kira she'ena gar fekatum, ayin le'el siman Reish Nun Gimel. I can't chazer Reish Nun Gimel now in middle of this year. Okay. Now, the Mishnah Berurah now makes a technical point. The words of the Rabbah were Hagav ein chilik bazeh be'ein muchai legamri ein shenis pashal k'tzas. The Rabbah said all of the Isurim, all of the Heterim, they apply equally if the food is raw or it's partially cooked. How about if the meat is fully cooked before Shabbos? Well, points out the Mishnah Berurah, if meat is fully cooked before Shabbos, then this whole conversation doesn't start. If it's fully cooked before Shabbos, then we don't have a problem. Tas. If we're talking about something that's going to be fully cooked before Shabbos, then even basar shar is going to be mutter to leave it next to the coals going into Shabbos, because there's no basis for a chash shem yechat b'gechalim. V'hinei le'el b'reish Siman Reish Nun Gimel mavur shtei doyes ma'u nikra b'shul aroi. Again, now you got to go back to Reish Nun Gimel. What does it mean to say that food is fully cooked before Shabbos, and therefore shehiyah is always mutter, even on a kira that's not gar fekatum, or next to coals that are not gar fekatum? What does fully cooked mean? Right? According to one shita, it means that it's mavushal called tzarchai and it's mitztamik varaloi. According to one shita, it means it's cooked to machal ben drusai. V'hodin binyanenu le'inyan sli. U'kamesha kasavnu l'maylo b'sif cotton dalit. Oh boy. Okay. Let's go weiter in this Ramah. That was the easy part of the Ramah. Next point of the Ramah, we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down the middle of the line. Says the Ramah, we spoke over here about a tender young goat that's cut into pieces. We spoke about poultry that's cut into pieces. What does cut into pieces mean? Does it mean young pullet cut into eighths? Exactly what does it mean? Does it mean cut into primal cuts? What does it mean? Says the Ramah, V'chol zman shechalal haguf shalem. As long as the torso of the animal or of the bird is intact, even if you took off the head and you took off the feet, mikri shalem, that's called whole. So you take a chicken and you did the shchita. When you do shchita, you don't cut off the whole head necessarily. You just have to cut roiv of the siman. So afterwards you cut off the head. So if you have a chicken and you just cut off the head and you just cut off the feet, that's called whole. That's not called cut up. So too by a goat. Okay? Next halacha in the Ramah, and here again we have to be very detailed and very careful. Says the Ramah, so far what we've seen over here has been the opinion of the Mechaber. Says the Ramah, v'yesh machmirin, there is another shita that is much more machmir than the Mechaber. V'soivrin, and they hold, de betan or tuach betit, if we're dealing with roasting next to coals inside an oven, the door is closed and it's been sealed with clay, hakoil shari, then everything is mutter. What does that mean? Okay, let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah over here. So one thing we have to realize right away. What does hakol shari mean? Everything is mutter. The Ramah is coming la'afuke from the Mechaber. The Mechaber said something. The Ramah is coming to tell you there's another shita that differs with the Mechaber. Now, what does the Mechaber hold when you have an oven with a closed door that's sealed with clay? So over there, the Mechaber holds, really, everything that the Mechaber spoke about, the Mechaber says is mutter in such an oven. You want to roast beef next to coals? That's usually usher if it's exposed, because we have a chashash because it might be ready for the Friday night Suda. But inside a sealed oven, the Mechaber said it's mutter. Now the Ramah's coming, there's another opinion that's more machmir than the Mechaber. That one holds, first he holds a kula. He holds that inside an oven that's sealed with clay, everything is mutter. Well, doesn't the Mechaber also hold everything is mutter? So let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. It says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting your dalet. Hakol shari, everything is mutter. What? What is this shita adding that's mutter over what the Mechaber said is mutter? Explains the Mishnah Berurah. It's Zayin Leimar. What the Rabbah wants to say is a case that we referenced earlier. The Mishnah Berurah earlier in Eis Cotton Yod Aleph said the Mechaber is introducing to us the heter of an oven that's closed and sealed with clay. How far do we take this heter? Could we take this heter all the way back to Siman Reish Nun Gimel? Could we use this heter to take a partially cooked cholent? You have a cholent that's just a little bit cooked, that has meat in it. It's not fully cooked. It's not mitztamik v'raloi. Maybe it's not even Michael ben Drusai. Shehiyah is always aser. Can we take that pot of cholent and put it into a tanner and seal the door with clay? The Mishnah Berurah told us in Eis Cotton Yud Aleph that according to the Mechaber, you're not allowed to do that. Why? Because the heter of tanner tuach betit doesn't help for a cholent in a closed pot. The heter of tanner tuach betit is that the air might hit the meat and make the meat tough. But if it's partially cooked meat inside a closed cholent pot, the cold air is not going to hit it, not going to make it tough, so there is no heter. That's where the Mechaber is more machmir than this shita that the Ramah is bringing down now. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting your dalet. When the Ramah says hakol shari, according to this yesh machmirin, first there's a heter. I know, he calls it a yesh machmirin, and we'll see why. But first, according to this yesh machmirin, there's a heter beyond the heter of the Mechaber. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ritzana Laimar, what the Ramah wants to say is, according to this shita, there's a heter inside a tanner tuch betit, afilu bikdera v'nispashal ktsas. Even if you're cooking a cholent in a pot, it's partially cooked, you put it inside a tanner, and you seal the door with clay. Why? Because this shita says, we're not afraid you're going to break open the oven, and do chitoi, since it's sealed with clay, and you can't just go over and do chitoi. In order to do chitoi, you have to break the oven door open. You're going to break the oven door open on Shabbos in order to do chitoi. And in this, the Ramah over here is arguing on the Mechaber, Shemachmer Bazeh. The Mechaber was Machmer on this case. Like I told you, it's Sifkat Yud Aleph. Now, we're introducing this Yesh Machmirin with a Kula. So why did the Ramah say Yesh Machmirin? Afagav Delinian Zehu Kula. Mishun de Bitzli da Anan Kaminan Bay, because the topic of Reish Nun Daled is not a cholent in a pot. The topic of Reish Nun Daled is roasting next to coals. And in the context of the topic of Reish Nun Daled, this opinion is going to be Machmir. Mishun de Bitzli da Anan Kaminan Bay, but because when it comes to the halachas of Tzli, which is what we're really discussing here in Reish Nun Daled, Hu Chumra, this shita is going to have a Chumra, Ukidala Kameh, like we're about to say. So now let's go back into the Ramah. So the Ramah said, "V'yesh machmirin v'sarvin de betana tuch betera kol shari." Va'al gabe ha'esh. Now gabe usually means on top. Over here, that's not what it means. Va'al gabe ha'esh. But if you're roasting next to al gabe, the Mishnah Berurah is going to say means eitzel. It means next to. Va'al gabe ha'esh. If you're roasting meat exposed and not in a pot, if you're roasting next to a fire, not sealed inside a tanur, shehu megula, a tanur that's opened, hakoil aser. Then everything is aser. Okay, what's the everything that's aser? Well, when it comes to roasting meat in an open oven or exposed in the air, roasting meat next to hot coals, over there, the mechaber differentiated between different types of meat. He said beef is aser because it might be ready before Shabbos, and if you do chita, you're not going to ruin it. A tender young goat that's cut up, tender poultry that's cut up, over there it's mutter because you're going to ruin it. So the mechaber had a tzad lahakel. The mechaber said, by the tender young goat, by the poultry, if it's cut up, you have a heter because there's no kshash shem yechad b'kolim, you're going to ruin the meat. This shita is machmir and says no. Even cut up tender young goat, even tender poultry that's cut up, if it's not inside a sealed oven, roasting is aser. Said that's what it means. Hakoil aser. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Tesvav, Val Gabe Eish. First points out the Mishnah Berurah, Al Gabe Eish does not mean what it seems to mean. It doesn't mean on top of the coals. Ein Ritzayin Elomer Al Gabe Gechol Mamish. He doesn't mean roasting, literally laying on top of hot coals. The Bazeh Afilu Laha Mechaber Hakol Aser. Because the Mechaber is going to tell me in Sif Beis, which I hope yet to get into today, the Mechaber is going to tell me that when you roast on top of hot coals, everything is aser. There's always an iser shem yechata b'gechalim. Because when you roast over mamish on top of hot coals, it shows that you're not concerned with burning. When you go ahead and roast something mamish on top of hot coals, it's clear that your only concern is I want to get this food ready as soon as possible, and I'm not worried about scorching the meat. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing it on top of hot coals. So the Bazeh Fil Lamechaber Kolaser Kumaysha Buvur Lakaman B'Sif Beis. Ella, what does the Ramah mean when he says over here Al Gabe Eish? Return Elamre Eitzel Eish. He means like we've been talking about since the beginning of Reish and Daled. He means next to hot coals. And with this Yesh Machmirin, where the Ramah says according to this opinion Hakoil Osir, he's contrasting to the opinion of the Mechaber. The Mechaber did not differentiate when it comes to young tender goat, young poultry that's cut up. The Mechaber didn't differentiate. The lechilik bebesar gedi shemuter beinim tzaleu betanu shepiv mechuse ubeinim tzaleu begalui eitzel ha'esh. The Mechaber gave a blanket heter to cut up young tender goat and to cut up poultry. He said, you want to roast it next to a fire in an open oven? Go ahead. There's no chash. You're going to ruin it. You want to do it inside a closed oven? Also go ahead. Adarabah, that's more makel. So the Mechaber gave a blanket heter to that kind of meat. Not so the Ramah. Avaladai toy. But according to this Yesh Machmirin brought down by the Ramah, Ein heter bigdi. There's no heter when it comes to the young tender meat of a young goat, or cut up poultry, or cut up goat. Kim kishetzeleu betanu shepiv mechuseh. That's not mutter if it's exposed. It's not mutter unless it's in a sealed oven. U'kamosh b'yarti atam le'el besif katan yud. I know that we're already 54 minutes in, but I want to be loyal to the Dirshu page, so we're going to go a little bit weiter. Oh, I didn't finish the Ramah, actually. We have to finish the Ramah over here. It says the Ramah, U'b'tanur shepiv mechuseh. When you're dealing with a tanner where the door is closed, but it's not sealed with clay, the Ramah says, when is there a difference between an oven door that's sealed with clay and an oven door that's not sealed with clay? Over there we could differentiate. Over there we could say that when you're dealing with the tender meat of a young goat that's cut up, or tender poultry that's cut up, over there we do make a chilik between an oven, roasting it in an oven that's sealed and roasting it in an oven that's not sealed. That's where we could be mechalik between basar gedi and, let's say, beef. By beef, the only heter is if it's inside a sealed oven. By basar gedi va'oif, over there will be matir even if the oven door is not sealed, as long as the oven door is closed. Okay, sif beis. Ein soilin batzar ubeitza oy basar al gabe gecholim. Now the Mechaber turns to roasting directly on top of hot coals. Till now, we were talking about next to coals. Now we're talking about on top of hot coals. Says the Mechaber, Ein soilin, you're not allowed to roast, a batzel, onion, ubeitza, an egg, a basar, or meat, al gabe gecholim, directly on top of hot coals. It has to be able to become roasted when it's still Erev Shabbos. Mishneit Stadov, on both sides. Michael ben Drusai, at least to the level of Michael ben Drusai. Shu Chatzi Bishulai, which the Mechaber says over here means halfway cooked. Afilu hu basar gedi. Even if we're talking about basar gedi. Why is the Mechaber saying this? Mechaber says, I told you in Sif Aleph that there's a tzad heter to basar gedi. By basar gedi, it could get burned, it could get scorched, so maybe we're not so worried. Shemi yechata b'gecholim. Says the Mechaber, not if you're roasting directly on top of coals. If you're roasting directly on top of coals, we're always worried. Shemi yechata b'gecholim, even by tender meat. Why? He explains. Because since you're putting the meat or these other types of foods right over the hot coals, clearly your only concern is you're only concerned with cooking this food ASAP. And you don't care even if it gets charred. Maybe you want it to get charred. Therefore, there's always a concern. But if it's already cooked through to the level of Michael ben Drusai, then we can't have a chashash shemi yechata b'gecholim. Afilu imhu basar shar. Even if we're talking about beef, we're still not going to have a chashash shemi yechata b'gecholim. Remember, by beef, there's more of a reason to say shemi yechata b'gecholim. A, it doesn't char so easy. B, it could be ready on time, and it would benefit from shemi yechata b'gecholim. So basar shar is a tzad le'isur. But says the Mechaber, if you're roasting directly on top of coals, we're always worried shemi yechata b'gecholim, shemi yachashu roi la'achila, because once it's cooked, k'maichel ben drusai, lam yechata lav sidai. Why would you do chitoi? There's a reason to do chitoi. Says the Mishnah Berurah back on Chafei and Aleph Tezayin. Batzel ubeitza. The Mechaber enumerated certain foods, among them onion and egg. V'huadid sharit var, says the Mishnah Berurah, it's not specific to this list. Other items as well, she'ein nachal and chayin, that can't be eaten raw. Uketel kameh, like we're going to see later. Ois kat yodzayin al gabe gecholim, on top of gecholim. What does on top of mean? It doesn't mean on your barbecue grill, on top of hot coals. Hainu shenoigin b'hagacholim. What the Mechaber is addressing over here is actually laying the food down, mamish on top of the coals. The food is touching the coals. Well, now, the Mishnah Berurah is wondering, if you're talking about doing shehiyah on food on top of coals, how are you going to get that food off the coals on Shabbos? In order to get the food off the coals on Shabbos, you're going to disturb the coals. Disturbing the coals, that could be havara. You might fire them up, which would be havara, and this is daraisa. It could be kivui. You could also be extinguishing coals. So how is it possible to do shehiyah on food that's touching coals? Explains the Mishnah Berurah. We're talking about where you're doing shehiyah on top of the hot coals, but you're not going to take the food off on Shabbos until the coals burn out. Why is the Mechaber saying that on top of hot coals there's a chashash shemi yechata b'gechalim, even by tender meat, which in Sif Aleph he said we don't have a concern shemi yechata b'gechalim because you'll burn it. Hu kamoisha mafarash achakach. It's as the Mechaber himself explains, the Kevin Shehinichai, because since you're laying it mamish on top of the coals in contact with the coals, it's very clear that your only concern is that this meat should get cooked ASAP, and you're not worried about burning. But when you're roasting next to coals, the topic of Sif Aleph, so then Kvar Nisbar b'Sif Aleph, that we discussed in Sif Aleph. The opinion of the Mechaber is if we're talking about tender cut up meat of young goats or poultry, we're not worried because if you're mechati, you're going to burn the meat. And therefore Shia is mutter right before Shabbos. Even if it's not going to get cooked, Michael ben Drusai and Erev Shabbos, because there's no chash shebiyachata b'gechalim. So Shia is mutter, even if it's only partially cooked. And when we're talking about beef or an adult goat, shu kasha, which is hard and will benefit from chitoi, she is only mutter if it's fully cooked, because otherwise there is a chash shemi yechate, because it might be ready for the Friday night suda and it would benefit from chitoi. Because it's not going to get ruined al yedei chitoi, kevan shehi eina munach agabi gechalim. V'das harama, and the opinion of the Ramah in Sif Aleph, if you're roasting next to coals, not on top of coals, ka poiskim, he paskins like the other shitas. The ein chilik ben al gabi gechalim oy b'samach. The Ramah paskined very much lechumra, and he said, doesn't matter if you're roasting on top of the coals, it doesn't matter if you're roasting next to the coals, right? It doesn't matter, even if it's next to the coals. Sif Aleph. Bein b'besar shor oy besar gediva oif, whether we're dealing with beef or we're dealing with the tender meat of a young goat or poultry, hashir sheyitzalim ba'od yom kamachal ben drusai. According to the Ramah, you want to roast these kind of meats, Erev Shabbos, even next to coals, they have to be cooked kamachal ben drusai before Shabbos comes in. V'mu tuach betit, if you're roasting it next to coals inside a sealed oven, so then Charlie didei b'chol gavni noisamach lechashecha, then she is mutter, because according to the Ramah, you're not going to break open the oven door in order to do chitoi. Delechashinan sheyistar atiach v'yachata ukvar kosam b'Sif Aleph denagu gisfarazu. Ois cotton yurches afilu hu b'sar gedei. The Mechaber said, you want to roast meat on top of coals, in contact with the coals. There's always a concern, shemi yechata b'gechalim, and shehiyah is going to be aser, even by the tender meat of cut up young goat or cut up poultry. Why, explains the Mishnah Berurah, tahainu afilu hu menutach, even if it's cut up, the mekelina le'el b'Sif Aleph, even the kula of the Mechaber in Sif Aleph won't apply, says the Mechaber, if you're laying it directly on top of hot coals. Hachal gabi gechalim shani, you could have been farish v'hoilech, like the Mechaber says, because when you roast directly in contact with hot coals, it's clear that you only want to cook this meat ASAP, and you're not worried about burning. If you're not worried about burning, then the risk of burning cannot mitigate the concern of Shema Yechata B'Gechalim. Wow, okay. Very difficult page. Listen, Rabbi Say, if I would read and teach, I could do it in 20 minutes. But if you really want to get into every line, and let me tell you something, I'm only scratching the surface. But just to know Pashut Pshat in every line, in every phrase, what the Mishnah Berurah is saying, what the Ramah is saying, I don't know that I could do it any faster. So I hope, those who stick with me, this is the style they enjoy. If not, there are others out there. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discuss of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshua for first panos and shaduchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the BS Tzedek b'meher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.